Restoring indigenous food sovereignty is an important initiative to ensure the preservation of indigenous cultures and the sustainability of their food systems. Indigenous food sovereignty is the right of indigenous people to maintain their traditional food systems and to make decisions about the production, distribution, and consumption of food. It is based on the recognition that indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own food and agriculture systems and practices in order to maintain their cultural identity and sustain their livelihoods. Restoring indigenous food sovereignty means that indigenous people must have the power to decide on their own food systems and nutrition. This includes the right to grow and harvest traditional crops, the right to hunt and fish in their territories, the right to access traditional foods, and the right to engage in cultural and spiritual practices related to food. It also means that indigenous people should have access to traditional foods and the necessary resources to produce them. Restoring indigenous food sovereignty also means addressing the historic and ongoing oppression of indigenous peoples. This includes addressing the environmental degradation of indigenous territories, the displacement of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands, and the disruption of traditional food systems. It also means challenging the colonialist policies and practices that continue to limit indigenous peoples' ability to access and produce traditional foods. Restoring indigenous food sovereignty requires a shift in the way we think about food and the relationship between indigenous people and their lands. It requires a shift away from the dominant food system, which is based on industrial agriculture, monocropping, and the commodification of food. It requires a shift toward an approach that emphasizes local production and consumption of traditional foods, the preservation of traditional agricultural practices, and the protection of indigenous territories and rights. Restoring indigenous food sovereignty is essential for the preservation of indigenous cultures and the sustainability of their food systems. It is an important part of the fight against food insecurity and climate change. It is also a major step in the process of reconciliation between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples. We must continue to work together to ensure that indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own food and agriculture systems and to produce and access traditional foods.